This video is sponsored by Squarespace. It's the question we've all been asking. Who will get to orbit first? SLS or Starship? Things certainly aren't going as fast as NASA and SpaceX might like, but are things getting clearer? The race isn't over yet. I'm Hagen Warren with NASA Spaceflight, and let's dig into where things stand with SLS and Starship and which might fly first. One of the major differences between SLS and Starship's current first flight readiness is their hardware. But for SLS, this isn't really a question. Everything you see here from rollout in March 2022 is full flight hardware for Artemis 1. The RS-25 engines, which have powered numerous space shuttle flights, have each undergone test firings on their own. These were followed by a combined, full-duration 8.5-minute static fire test with the core stage in 2021. The solid rocket boosters are also largely using components from the space shuttle era. Even so, NASA engineers are currently replacing a failed helium check valve on SLS's interim cryogenic propulsion stage, or ICPS, while the rocket is back in the VAB following its first 3 attempts at a wet dress rehearsal in April. More on this situation later. However, we should point out that while all flight hardware is essentially ready for Artemis 1 pending a successful wet dress rehearsal, some of it will change for future missions when crews start flying on SLS and Orion. Only a few systems necessary for crew safety on the Orion and the European Service Module, namely a fully working launch abort system and a fully working life support system, are missing as they simply aren't needed on this first uncrewed test flight. But in all, the rocket flying the first mission is nearly identical to the crew carrying SLS for Artemis 2 and beyond, something to keep in mind as we continue to analyze the two rocket systems. However, for Starship, it's always tricky to identify what the flight hardware is. Given that Booster 7's transfer tube is heavily damaged, it is unclear which booster and ship will be the flight hardware for the first orbital test. Even assuming that either Booster 7 or 8 with Ship 24 is used for the flight, this still leaves a significant road ahead for Starship. Ship 24 is still not fully stacked, nor does it have its 6 Raptor engines, and while heat shield tile installation on the nose cone and other parts of the ship is ongoing, it will take some time before Ship 24 is ready for action. Booster 7, on the other hand, has already been out to the pad for ground testing and is now back at the production site. The question now is if SpaceX will repair Booster 7 and still use it for the orbital flight, or use a later prototype such as Booster 8, but teams have not yet finished assembly of the full tank section for it. And regardless of the booster used, both Boosters 7 and 8 still need their full set of 33 Raptor engines installed. Speaking of the Raptors, Raptor 2 is absolutely needed for the first orbital flight. Elon mentioned in this tweet that SpaceX hopes to have the full set of 39 engines ready by May. Some of those engines are undoubtedly undergoing testing now at SpaceX's McGregor facility. You can watch live testing over on NASA Spaceflight's new McGregor livestream. Of course, when it comes to engine development, there's always the potential for more delays or issues that need to be solved, and SpaceX has still not yet fired more than 6 Raptors at the same time on the same vehicle. And no Raptor 2 engines have ever been installed onto a Starship or booster for testing, let alone a flight to orbit. Overall, the current combination of flight hardware is not ready, and even when all the parts of the vehicle reach the pad, it will likely take weeks, if not months, to thoroughly test them. However, it's important to remember here that Starships, unlike SLS, are only simple prototypes compared to future vehicles. You know what else is simple? Squarespace. Over to my man Jack to tell you more.
Thanks to Squarespace, both for making this video possible and for making it possible for even a numbskull like me to build a website that looks professional. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform for building your online presence or business, with loads of easy-to-use features and great-looking designs. With Squarespace, you don't have to set wads of cash on fire and hire a web designer to have a website that looks like you did. Squarespace has powerful blogging tools to help you share stories, photos, videos, and more. Plus, you can categorize and schedule your posts to make the most out of your content. I set up my website as an online portfolio, as well as a place to sell prints of my photos. Squarespace makes it remarkably easy to set up an online store or collect donations toward your cause. So easy, in fact, that I had no problems doing so. And of course, they have excellent analytics to help you figure out what's working and what isn't. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/NASASpaceflight to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Back to you, Hagen.
But there's more to a rocket than the components that go to space. The ground equipment is equally necessary. And this is where things get interesting. When SLS rolled out for its wet dress rehearsal, this was intended as a way to find issues before launch. And to be fair, Launch Complex 39B's systems have largely worked quite well considering the major redesign and rework following the end of the shuttle program. Even so, issues were bound to come up. Aside from a few minor ground hiccups at the pad for positive air pressure and a manual valve that was supposed to be open but was accidentally left closed, things proceeded as generally expected until the third attempt ended with a liquid hydrogen leak in the tail service mast lines that pump fuel into SLS's gigantic core stage. This has been the most serious issue to date, but it's one the team actually had a plan to fix at the pad before another issue forced a rollback to the vehicle assembly building. Completely outside of NASA's control, Air Liquide had numerous issues supplying the needed amount of gaseous nitrogen for the SLS test. To fix this, the company will install more robust equipment at their facility just off Kennedy Space Center grounds. The time needed to get that new equipment up and running allowed SLS to come back to the vehicle assembly building to repair the tail service mast liquid hydrogen leak, as well as to take care of the ICPS helium check valve issue. In contrast, Starship's ground equipment is still very much under construction. Several new methane tanks were delivered to the launch site over the last few months as SpaceX cannot use their Starship-derived GSC tanks for methane storage, though they can use them for liquid nitrogen and liquid oxygen. In March, SpaceX tested a full-stack Starship with liquid oxygen and liquid nitrogen, and even fueled Booster 4 from the orbital tank farm with methane. But the work still needed before a first orbital flight does not stop with the tank farm. There's ongoing work with the launch and catch tower systems, specifically with the lobster claw that grabs the top part of the booster to stabilize the vehicle for stacking, as well as fueling the rocket. What is apparently not an issue are the chopsticks. They have successfully managed to stack and unstack Ship 20 from Booster 4 multiple times. Overall, the GSC is surely among the long pole items that need to be sorted out before any kind of orbital flight is attempted. Next up is regulatory approval, the topic everyone really wants to know about. This is the one place where SLS has always been ahead of Starship. As a government vehicle launching from an established spaceport, SLS is not subject to the same regulatory process that Starship is going through with the commercial space division of the FAA. And no, that doesn't mean SLS is not subject to regulation, just that the process is different because it's a government vehicle and not a commercial vehicle. One element that will significantly impact the Artemis 1 launch schedule is the rocket's flight termination system. This flight safety system is certified for about 20 days once it's fully tested and approved. And this test has to take place inside the vehicle assembly building because it's the only place where workers can access the system. Now, once the 20-day clock starts, it will take about 14 days to get SLS ready for an initial launch attempt. This means Artemis 1 only has about 7 days of launch opportunities based on its flight termination system certification. If the launch doesn't happen before the certification expires, the Space Force and NASA would have to either accept a waiver for this condition, or SLS would have to roll back to undergo the entire certification process again. From a regulatory process, Starship is far more complicated. Currently ongoing is the environmental review and permitting process, which contains 5 sub-processes. Of these, 3 are complete, but the Section 106 review and the environmental assessment are still missing. The FAA has said this will hopefully be done by the end of May. However, the process has slipped by a few months already and could easily slip further. The process was further delayed by SpaceX modifying the existing proposal. After the review is complete and hopefully comes back green, it still does not mean that a launch license for Starship will be issued. As we saw in the past with Starhopper and multiple Starship prototype vehicles, this process can also take a few months on its own. Furthermore, it is not a guarantee that the FAA and other regulatory bodies will grant a launch license to Starship without homework. But both rockets have more pre-flight testing ahead of them regardless of regulatory status. And while Starship has substantially more testing left than SLS, NASA's Big Moon rocket also has a longer path of testing than was hoped. In simple terms, SLS really hasn't progressed much in the last month. A full wet dress rehearsal is still needed after the first 3 attempts got as far as a partial fueling of the core stage with liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. SLS is currently back in the VAB and workers are repairing the helium check valve and liquid hydrogen leak issues. The current plan is to roll back out in May for an anticipated wet dress rehearsal no earlier than June. However, there are other options available to NASA based on how quickly Air Liquide can solve the biggest issue, supplying the large amount of gaseous nitrogen SLS requires. NASA has stated that if Air Liquide requires more time than planned to install its new equipment, SLS teams might keep the vehicle in the VAB longer and configure some of it for launch before going out for wet dress rehearsal. After a successful wet dress rehearsal, SLS will come back to the VAB for final configuration for launch. This will include removing all sensors that were only needed for wet dress rehearsal, installing the ordnance needed to separate the solid rocket boosters and stages during flight, as well as the big ticket item, activating and testing the flight termination system with the range. Starship has an even longer path in terms of pre-flight testing, and this is complicated because we don't yet know which booster and which ship will ultimately fly the first orbital mission. What we do know is the standard path SpaceX has taken so far in testing the Starship system before flight. Each element, booster and ship, will likely undergo pneumatic and then cryo-proof tests before static fires of their Raptor 2 engines. SpaceX might also seek to repeat static fire tests using a greater and greater number of engines, culminating with a test of all 33 Raptor engines at once. It can also be expected that SpaceX will conduct a complete wet dress rehearsal where the full stack is fully loaded with propellant. To date, SpaceX has never fully loaded even a Starship, as the flight tests have used only a partial propellant load. And given Starship's young age, changes to the system or processes found through pre-flight testing could still be forthcoming, that then require further testing. This is underlined by the recent issues that came up with the transfer tube MB7. To put it simply, there is still a mountain of pre-flight testing before Starship is ready to attempt to reach orbit. And this leads us to the biggest question of them all: when orbit? Given the timelines after a wet dress rehearsal, it is unlikely that SLS could be ready in time for the late June, early July lunar launch window. More likely is the late July, early August window, but this is highly complicated by another NASA mission called Psyche that has an interplanetary launch window that opens on August 1st. These interplanetary missions usually have priority over all other flights because missing an interplanetary window can result in months or years of delays. SLS, on the other hand, could simply wait a few more weeks for the mid to late August window. But wait, there's more. Artemis 1 is heading to a distant retrograde orbit around the Moon. This means that there are about 2 weeks of launch opportunities each month, followed by 2 weeks of no launch opportunities. This is based on the position of the Earth and the Moon in relation to each other, and getting the flight where it needs to go. So with the flight termination system already reducing the 2-week window to about 7 days, the pad's current propellant storage for liquid hydrogen further reduces the available launch days to about 3 days per 2-week launch period. Regardless of the final timeline, summer 2022 could be awesome for SLS. And hopefully, this summer is good for Starship too, but that is far less clear. Yes, there are some targets that Elon has given in the past, but they are just that in the end, targets. Based on the latest tweet from Elon, the target was hopefully May, but that was before the FAA announced that the environmental review would not be completed until late April, and later announced another slip to late May at the earliest. However, Elon's May target was almost always going to slip regardless. In the end, it is a very hard goal that SpaceX has set for itself when designing the first fully reusable rocket, and delays do happen in spaceflight all the time. Every possible test and milestone that is still on the path to orbit has a possibility to shine light on new challenges that need to be solved. So, what does all this mean? Well, we likely have an actual race in our hands for which rocket will attempt an orbital flight first. While SLS has become known for its delays, it is far ahead of Starship when it comes to technical risk. But it wouldn't take much at this point for Starship to even the playing field if the FAA assessments are completed in May. But it is also important to remember the context here. Starship has been in serious development for only a few years, with only a couple $2 billion in investment. SLS, on the other hand, has been in development for a decade, leverages substantial flight heritage, and has had tens of billions of dollars in funding. It is impressive that Starship is even where it is right now relative to SLS. Conversely, the Artemis 1 mission will feature the production version of SLS. Starship will fly to orbit with a prototype design that is far from the operational variant, and certainly not certified to fly crew. While time will tell which one flies first, one thing is for certain. It will be an exciting summer as these two super heavy lift rockets, connected via the Artemis program, conduct their historic first missions of these really complex systems. And that's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. We'll see you all next time.